For more on all of this, I want to bring in Erica Andiola, immigrant rights activist and former press secretary for Latino outreach for Bernie Sanders, Mark McKinnon, former advisor to George W. Bush and John McCain, and Simone Sanders Townsend, former chief spokesperson for Vice President Harris, the co-host of one of my favorite shows ever, The Weekend, here on MSNBC. You got to watch it if you haven't. It's really, really good. So, Simone, you actually told Vanity Fair that the speech will be as much about performance and delivery as the actual content. What do you mean by that?
You know, the State of the Union is going to be the biggest stage that President Biden has between now and the general election. His convention speech will be big, but that is a partisan activity that does not get nearly as many eyeballs as the State of the Union. And so for people who are tuning in, who will be at their kitchen tables, maybe having dinner or, you know, dessert after dinner, because it is going to be 9 o'clock on Eastern Standard Time, or folks sitting on the couch at home, this is their opportunity to see and hear the president in his own words giving an update to the American people. And so how he delivers the speech, his inflection points, all of those things are going to make a difference. And in my experience before Joe Biden has done a big speech like this, he practices the performance and the delivery aspect of it and puts just as much stock in that piece as writing the speech.
So you've been there, right? I mean,
yeah.
How does he practice? How does one practice for things like delivery, inflection?
Going through where are the applause lines? Every you know, principle is different, but there are applause lines written into the speech. And so understanding where you're going to pause, where you want to put additional inflection on, how you want to, what points you really want to make sure you hit home, literally practicing the speech. So I would absolutely expect that today in the White House, there's going to be a mock practice, if you will, of, you know, the president delivering his State of the Union address. But not too much, you know, you want to save his voice. It's late tonight.
9 p.m. Mark, how important is the speech tonight for the president?
It's huge. As Simone said, this is one of the few opportunities you're going to have to get a lot of people watching him. And I agree with Simone. It's not so much important as to what he says as to how he says it. People are looking very generally to just see if he's up to the job. This is the biggest bully pulpit. Can he stand and deliver? And I think again, what people want to see is that he's spry, that he's alert, and I think that what he ought to do or try to do is do what he did last year, which is ad lib, go off script, show that he doesn't have to have a script. I mean, that's what a lot of people think is that Biden can't walk or talk without a script or chew gum. So if there's some heckling or whatever it might be from the audience, go off script, show that he can act in the moment. And that shows real mental acuity. It shows that he's on top of his game. And I think that's what's going to be important. The other thing I would just say is to recognize, as we did in 2004 when I was working for George W. Bush, you got a long haul and you start off behind and just figure out a strategy. And even if it's an imperfect strategy, be consistent. Don't change your strategy every week or every month just because everybody's freaking out. Lock in and load.
And Erica, NBC News has learned that President Biden is unlikely to unveil any new executive actions on immigration or the border in his address. What would you like him to say about that tonight? Eric, I think you're on mute. Let me get you off mute real quick. Sorry.
My apologies.
Not at all.
I would, you know, for me, what's important is that he doesn't continue to basically repeat some of Republican talking points as he did when he went to the border. The reality is that there is a humanitarian crisis, and it reflects the crisis that we have seen around the world, and especially in places where people are leaving. But we want to make sure, I want to hear him humanize the immigrant community and talk about the importance of fixing our immigration system and really calling out the hypocrisy of the Republicans, of how they continue to point at the immigrant community, continue to point at what's happening at the border, but don't want to do anything to fix the broken immigration system, but rather they want to use the issue to continue to run the elections, right? To continue to have something to run on. And I really hope he calls out that hypocrisy right in front of them. He's going to have him right in front of him. And to talk about why he's not going to do this, but I hope he talks about the immigrant community here in the United States, who he has promised he is going to fix the immigration system for them and give them a path to citizenship. He also hasn't talked about that anymore. So I hope he acknowledges some of those promises that he made during his campaign.
You know, Erica, I don't even know how many years you and I have have known each other and how many years we have been speaking about this and how many years the plight and the incredible hopes, dreams, and aspirations of millions of people who are here. They don't have documents, but they have U.S.-born children. In many ways, they have contributed incredibly to our economy, to our society, to our culture, and yet they are ignored until it's time to talk about elections. Why is it so difficult, Erica, to humanize so many important people?
It is. And the fact is that the issue is still here. People in this country continue to be undocumented, millions and millions of people, including some of my family members. And the fact is that, you know, during this election cycle, Democrats have forgotten about us. I mean, President Biden has really forgotten how many people within the immigrant community, people who have supported the immigrant community, have come out to support even his election campaigns in previous years. People who have worked with organizations who have canvassed, who have done so much work to elect him as a president, and all of a sudden the focus has completely just gone to the border, and there's not even an acknowledgement of our humanity, and even an acknowledgement that we continue to provide so much, that we continue to help the economy of this country, and that we're still the workers that are literally feeding your families by, you know, working in the farms and building your buildings, right? And so to me, I really hope that there's at least an acknowledgement talking about the dreamers and all the people who have never really been paid attention to in this election cycle.
Simone, I mean, these are people that contribute and that have the same dreams and aspirations and hopes as everyone else, and yet they are really pretty much ignored unless it's election season, right? And I'm just wondering, how do you talk about people that are very real contributors to our economy, to our country, to our society, in such a polarized, difficult political world?
I like to say that dreamers and everyone that we just described are Americans in every sense of the word, except not on paper. Look, I think that this is something that the president should hit on in the speech. Remember, the State of the Union is an hour. He could go. Last year, I think he went like 104. So there are a number of things that have to be addressed in this speech, and I think you are going to hear him talk about immigration. But I do think that it is going to be about border security, and then a nod, maybe a sentence nod to what Erica spoke about. But the work, I think, on that is that the campaign and, frankly, the White House writ large, the government has to do, is in the weeks and days and months to come. Because there is you can't talk about the recovery of the United States of America that recovered. I saw Steve Benjamin on earlier, and former mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, now advisor to the president. And you cannot talk about the historic recovery better than any other G7 country without talking about the way in which immigrant individuals contributed to that. They are directly linked. And what policies that demonize instead of humanizing people who, again, many folks, Americans in every sense of the word except on paper.
And Mark, I'm sorry.
It's going to be key and a challenge. And what you heard from Erica is a sentiment that there are voters across the country have. Those are voters folks are going to need and want when it comes to November 2024.
And Mark, President Biden is expected to point the finger at congressional Republicans when it comes to the issue of the humanitarian crisis at the border, security. His chief of staff told Politico. How do you think this is going to translate into a speech tonight?
Well, I think he'll emphasize the point that Democrats and Republicans had a plan, had a solution that will work, and that the Republicans bailed because they wanted to just gain political points for Donald Trump in November. But the other thing I'll say, Jose, is that Biden has to show that it's a priority, that he cares, and that he has a plan. And what confounds me is that I know from reading in your own reports from MSNBC that the DHS has had a plan on the shelf to give resources to other cities around the country that are not just on the border. So it's a shared responsibility to take in immigrants, to give them resources, to help them relocate across America. And we've never heard about it. And that would have preempted DeSantis and Abbott shipping all these migrants north. Biden needs to show that he's got his own plans. And the remarkable thing is he does, and he hasn't talked about them.
Erica Andiola, Mark McKinnon, and Simone Sanders Townsend, thank you so very much. And Erica, I always remember that you are part of the millions of American families that live in mixed status immigration in their home. And never forget your impact and of your mom and of your whole family. So I want to thank you again for being with us.